So let's jump in. We are recording. Are the slides up for you to see?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to finish chapter 16 right off the bat here. And before we do that, let me show you something else that will be available. This is the outline that I've prepared for chapters. Let me change this to 18. 16, 17, and 18, because they are all a part of this part 5 in the textbook. And now remember, we'll also cover chapter 15 in the test, but we will review that on Wednesday. So here's the outline I'm following. We made it right here to the alliance of business and politics. The last thing we talked about concerning big businesses and the movement to secure rights for workers was that several of the very, very wealthy tycoons like Andrew Carnegie believed in the gospel of wealth. Their belief was that those who made enormous profits from society should give back to society. What we're going to move into now is the alliance during the Gilded Age of business, and that is big business, of course, in politics. During the last few years of the Civil War and then into Reconstruction, there was quite a few pieces of legislation passed that really favored big business. So you had this tariff in 1861 during the beginning of the Civil War that basically doubled, and a tariff is a tax that foreign countries have to pay to ship their goods into our nation. So they doubled the tariffs in 1861 on foreign countries, which made it possible for American businesses to secure more business. The Homestead Act of 1862 is a piece of legislation that you want to highlight and know for the test. The Homestead Act of 1862. What this did was it gave anyone who went west and settled on a plot of ground of 160 acres, they could pay $10, and then they had to live there for 5 years. They had to build a home. They had to farm it and improve it for 5 years. And after 5 years, that homestead became theirs. This was during the Civil War also, as you can see, 1862. And there was a political purpose to the Homestead Act. The North would, as they fought against the South, and as people continued to move west, by doing this, they were going to tie the people who moved west into the Northern government. Then there's some other acts there that favored big business. And so that's one of the points on our outline, is that the federal government during this time, and even as we move past Reconstruction, the federal government, and especially the Republicans, always, well, not always, mostly sided with big business and not the workers. Another reason for this, or actually another way to refer to this, is laissez-faire theory, right here in the red. Because our government leaders believed in a free enterprise system where citizens could start businesses and run them the way they wanted to, the government had an approach to where they were laissez-faire, which simply means they will not interfere with businesses. They will basically be hands-off. So that's why big businesses really prospered during this time, but it was at the expense of the American workers. During this time, the government really did very little domestically, that is, in the United States. Their main duties were to deliver the mail, keep up a national army, collect taxes, deal with foreign governments, and take care of Civil War veterans. American citizens did not expect much from the federal government. Most of the government help they received was from the local level or the state level. There was a lot of corruption in businesses because of party bosses. During this time, the presidency was rather weak. Congress was more powerful, and big business tycoons were able to give bribes to congressmen so that they would be in favor of big businesses. Presidents during this time basically, in a sense, had less power than the big business leaders. Any questions on that as we move to chapter 17? All right, let's jump back to the outline very quickly. And as you can see, for these chapters, 16, 17, and 18, I've given them a one-word description to kind of summarize what we're looking at. So chapter 16 was industrialization. Chapter 18 will be immigration. So now we're going to move to chapter 17, which the key word is expansion. We're talking about human expansion within the United States, and we're breaking it up into these three categories. We're going to talk about the New South, and we're going to focus on their economic expansion. We're going to look at the New West, and we're going to focus on the industries that are there, and we will begin to touch on human immigration or migration, but we will really cover that in chapter 18 in depth. And then the European settlers moving west clashing with Native Americans. So let's begin to look at the New South. And their economic expansion. So I will go back now to the slides. And when we talk about the New South, we are referring to the end of construction, or I'm sorry, the end of Reconstruction. The Democrats have gained control again of the South. Reconstruction has ended, which was a program by the Republicans from the North. And now we come to 1877, and the New South is characterized by Southerners being back in control politically, but also you have some businessmen in the South who want to see the South catch up to the North as far as industry is concerned. Remember, before the Civil War, one big difference between North and South was the North, even though they had farms, they were more industrial. The South was more agricultural, with the main crops of cotton and tobacco. After the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the South still was mainly agricultural. And remember, they were rebuilding their landscape and their businesses because it had been destroyed. But now you had businessmen who were rising up after Reconstruction, and they wanted to see industries come to the South. So while you still had cotton and tobacco being produced, and they continued to enjoy good business, you had another industry rise up in the South, the textile industry, and it grew very quickly as it made use of the Southern cotton to produce new products. Another reason why so many textile industries came to the South was they had cheaper labor. Remember, you had hundreds of thousands of now free African Americans, but they didn't own any land. They didn't own any land or property. They had to work, and so they would work at lower wages than the whites in the North. Factories and mills also sprung up in the South to produce new materials. Lumber factories shot up. You also had mining companies, coal mining, iron ore mining. Iron ore is a big industry in Alabama, centered in Birmingham. Has anyone been to Birmingham, Alabama? So if you go to Birmingham, you can see this huge iron statue called Vulcan. Yes, Vulcan is not a Star Trek thing. It was an actual Greek god. And I believe he is the god of iron. And so because Birmingham had so many iron ore mining businesses in that area, they constructed this. You can see the size of it here on the pedestal. Built this huge statue of Vulcan, and here you can see it overlooking the city. So if you ever go to Birmingham, check out Vulcan, and you can tell your friends or family, you can drop some knowledge on them and say, oh, before they even read all the plaques, Vulcan is the god of iron, and that's because there's a lot of iron ore in Birmingham area. So the New South had industry along with agriculture growing, but there were also some failings in the New South. One of the failings was the crop lien system. A lot of your smaller farmers would borrow money and they basically would borrow the money against their upcoming harvest. So they would borrow the money before the harvest to get their supplies, plant the seed, work the harvest, work the ground, work the harvest, and then they would pray for a good harvest. But a lot of times, look at here, there would not be a good harvest. They would not make enough money to pay back their loans, and so they would go further and further into debt. So this was one of the failings of the New South. So poverty continued in the New South, and today some of the poorest regions in America are in the South and the Midwest. All right, any questions on the New South? Make sure you read chapter 17 if you haven't, to fill in these gaps, because we're moving pretty quickly. All right, let's talk about the New West. Before the Civil War, we had people moving westward. But then the Civil War hit in 1860, and the majority of young men who normally in the North would be heading west had to fight in the war. So westward migration and expansion kind of stalled. But after the war, you had Northerners as well as Southerners, and especially Confederate soldiers, moving west to start over. There was opportunities to get farmland, ranch land. There were exciting possibilities of prospecting, right? You could look for gold and silver and other precious metals. So many people went west looking for gold. You had a lot of people go to the San Francisco area in 1849, looking for gold. And today, San Franciscoans are saddened that the 49ers lost yesterday to the Chiefs. As I'm sure most of you are sad about that, right? I figured most of you were Chiefs fans, but anyway, now you know where the name 49ers came from, right? The gold rush. But they continued to come after the Civil War looking for gold, looking for silver. So this term, manifest destiny, you need to know that term. It's the idea that Americans, and we're talking about European Americans who came to the New World, have a destiny to eventually go all the way across the continent and claim it for themselves. So manifest destiny is one reason European Americans are moving westward, looking for gold and silver, looking for ranches, looking for farms, wanting to start over. And remember, we now have a railroad that can go all the way across to the Pacific Ocean and transport goods and people and help populate the West. But I see that hand in how. Just seeing if you're listening. Okay, but It wasn't just the European Americans moving west. You had African Americans called exodusters coming from the south. Anybody want to know why they were called exodusters? Anybody want to guess or anybody know?
Teachers,
Seconds.
all students who attended last week's speaker, Dr. Pearson, and did
For
not,
the Bible Exodus.
please stop by the tag classroom during lunch.
Please be right.
I'm waiting for them to get done. I heard you.
Please sign in or you may be counted. I'm going to Eastern Oklahoma State College tomorrow. We will leave at 9:15 and do a call out for all tag 9th through 12th grades. Any non-tag seniors who are interested, please see Ms. Akins today.
I'm going to get a sip of my sweet tea.
Should return by 1. FCCLA
All right with you guys.
Wednesday, February 5th. And good luck once more to Hope, Shanti, and Molly.
Guess what was on the other day on TV?
The yearbook staff will be taking orders for Tiger
Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Did anybody catch it?
Bar and Tiger Tail, $5. All 10th graders will participate
My
in
goodness.
ACT on Monday, February 10th at Talladega KTC. Students will be called out at 8.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. Yes, it is a reference to their leaving the South, exiting out of the South, and the exodusters term is a reference to the Israelite exodus in the Old Testament as they left Egypt. So you had white Americans from the East going west to stake their fortunes. You have African Americans, the exodusters, coming from the South, leaving behind their old places where they live because they no longer are slaves. They're free, but they're still treated poorly. They're still there's black codes and Jim Crow laws that are designed to keep them basically inferior to the whites. So they move west. You have immigrants from other countries, China, and other European countries moving to the United States and living out in the West. So we will cover that group, the third group, the immigrants, in detail. Well, I will cover them tomorrow and post that lecture. But European Americans and African Americans are moving moving west. And one of the things is they're looking for silver and gold. And one of the famous discoveries was the Comstock lode. For 20 years, they mined about $500 million worth of precious metal. There was a lot of open range. The government allowed cattle ranchers to use those lands for free grazing. That's before they started using barbed wire fence. And oh, please forgive me, but one of the big cattle breeds was the Longhorn. They could travel long distance on little water. The exodusters. But as these groups are moving west, you have a few settlers already out there, but you have a big group of people that were moved there starting in the 1830s. Who am I talking about? People that were forcibly moved from the east in the south.
Exodusters.
Nope.
Native Americans.
Native Americans. Right. The Native Americans were moved from the southeast, Florida, Georgia. That's where the five civilized tribes came from when they came to the Oklahoma Territory, which at that time was called the Indian Territory. But you had other forced migrations of Native Americans, right? And they were put on these big areas called
Plains.
No, they were on the plains, but reservations, right? So we had, our government had made treaties with the Native Americans, right? We're going to give you the Indian Territory, you 5 tribes. And then they produced, then they created other reservations, and they made treaties with so many different tribes. Now, do you think our government told the Exodusters and the white Europeans from the East, now as you go west, you've got to honor those treaties with the Native Americans? Do you think our government was very careful to do that?
No.
No. And so you had those that were migrating, clashing with Native Americans. And then who would the government usually side with after one of these clashes? The Native Americans or the white European Americans?
The
white, yeah. And so the government broke a lot of treaties. And you'll see here that one of those things that was changed was Indian Territory was opened up, right, to white settlers. It was called Oklahoma. And why do we have a sports team called Sooners?
Because of the Sooners.
Who were the Sooners?
People that got there way too fast and took all the land.
Well, the people that left early.
Yeah, not that they got there too fast, but they left. They didn't wait until the land run started. The land run was like this race, literally, where you were on the border of Oklahoma, and when the gunshot fired, here went all these horses and wagons speeding out into the land to stake a claim. Now, when I was in 6th grade, we had a little land run at our school. Maybe some of you had one, I don't know. But people who left early, who snuck across, were called Sooners. So that's where that comes from. But we had a government agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but they broke so many treaties. So they did set up reservations, but then they didn't always honor those treaties. A lot of times the reservations would have been not the choicest land, if that makes sense, okay?
Yeah.
So the Civil War ends and you have all these Union troops heading west, also to subdue the Native Americans. And those who joined were promised that they could claim anything that was taken from the Native Americans. This was the way for the government. They felt like they needed to keep control, and so they would do this. So there were several skirmishes and clashes between Native Americans and the government. You did an assignment over probably one of the most famous ones, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Has anyone been there? In South Dakota?
No. I think Michaela has been there twice.
Awesome. It's pretty neat. But if you don't know the story, General Custer, who was kind of an arrogant general, and I believe he had around 300 troops, or he might have had less than 200, but there was a couple of other Union soldiers, Union generals in the area. They came upon a Sioux and Cheyenne encampment that had about 20,000 Native Americans. And it was a massacre. The first major battle that was won by the American Indians, but as we talked about in our assignment, probably the beginning of the end of the government trying to control the Native Americans. Another massacre was the Sand Creek Massacre of 1884. Eventually, the government tried to assimilate the Native Americans into white society. And the main piece of legislation for this was the Dawes General Allotment Act, where they would get rid of the reservation system, because the Native Americans, they lived in like a communal society, right? A big community on a reservation. They would group hunt for their food. Everything was very group oriented. In order to get them civilized, as they thought, into white society, they broke up the reservations and they gave each family 160 acres to farm like European Americans, which not too many Native Americans took that offer up. So, so the New West, let me go back now to the outline as we finish up. The New West, I'm sorry, chapter 17, expansion for the nation as a whole involved an economic expansion in the South with more industries cropping up, basically a migration of people and I don't want to say businesses, but people and fortune seekers going to the West, whether they're seeking their fortune in gold or ranching or farming. And then a key element to this expansion is the Native American, the European Americans moving west and basically putting down the resistance of Native Americans. While all Native Americans did not assimilate, for the most part, the tribes were subdued. And today we see that there are still Native American nations existing in our country, but they have to exist within the framework of the federal government of the United States. So, any questions on the Chapter 17 material? So again, I will have this outline available along with today's slides and the video. I will have chapter 18 video posted tomorrow, so make sure you try to watch it before Thursday, and then Wednesday we will review. Any questions?
No, sir.
A good movie to check out about the American government clashing with Native Americans, Dances with Wolves. Great movie, about 3.5 hours long, but excellent movie on giving you a historical perspective. So have a great day tomorrow, and we'll see you Wednesday.